47 people were killed when Israel targeted a Hamas leader in a refugee camp. 4 Israelis were injured by Hamas rocket fire. With EU expansion and solutions for Serbia's tensions with Kosovo on the agenda, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen visits Belgrade. At Jabalia, a refugee camp in Gaza, 2 huge craters among the rubble where several houses once stood. Each crater was made by an Israeli missile. At least 47 bodies have been recovered. Israel said a Hamas commander was killed in the attack. The Hamas-run health authority says more than 8,500 people have died in Gaza since Israel's bombardment began. The Israeli army's announced the deaths of 2 of its soldiers as it attacked underground strongholds of Hamas in the northern Gaza Strip. Israel said it had killed dozens of terrorists. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu held a socio-economic cabinet with one of the aims being to provide for soldiers mobilized by war. Government officials in Israel said they didn't anticipate a deal for the release of 240 hostages being held in Gaza. Hamas continues to fire its rockets at Israel, and although most are intercepted by its Iron Dome air defense system, 4 people in Israel were injured when 2 rockets hit the coastal city of Ashdod.
As the families of hostages in Gaza campaign for the freedom of their loved ones, Hamas says it will release a number of them in the coming days. Relatives held a vigil for captives at a synagogue in Paris on Tuesday. It came shortly after a Hamas statement on the foreigners it's holding.
ووصلتنا طلبات هذه الدول وبالتالي فإننا أبلغنا الوسطاء بأننا سنفرج عن عدد من الأجانب خلال الأيام القادمة انسجاما مع موقفنا الذي أعلناه مبكرا عن عدم رغبتنا ولا حاجتنا للاحتفاظ بهم أو استمرار احتجازهم في غزة.
At the French Parliament, relatives urged the international community to do more to secure the release of people abducted on October 7th.
We really need all the pressure that we can get in order to demand Hamas to free the hostages. It makes no sense to live in a world when people get kidnapped from their beds, when people get kidnapped just by going to a party.
On Tuesday, the Israel Defense Forces raised the number of hostages confirmed as being held by Hamas to 240. The IDF say they and Gaza's civilian population are being used as human shields.
French police shot and seriously injured a woman in a full veil after she threatened train passengers in Paris. Witnesses described scenes of panic at the Bibliothèque François Mitterrand station on the RERC as a woman shouted threats.
Une dame qui portait un voile intégral, tenait un certain nombre de propos qui étaient assez menaçants, parlant de commission d'attentats, utilisant un certain nombre de mots tels qu'ils m'ont été rapportés comme vous allez tous y passer, Allah Akbar, boum, je cite, et donc ces 2 personnes ont relaté ces faits de la même façon. Encore une fois, un signalement en gare de Choisy-le-Roi à un agent compétent de la SNCF, et puis par ailleurs un appel qui a été donc transmis au numéro d'urgence de la SNCF.
Division within the EU over the response to Hamas's terrorist attack in Israel threatens to impede the bloc from having any meaningful influence on the future of the region. It's also potentially damaged the EU's credibility from having a strong voice on the importance of international law and protection of civilians during armed conflict. Europe's ambiguity has been criticised by EU partners, including King Abdullah of Jordan, who says the EU sees Palestinian lives as worth less than others. EU leaders called for humanitarian pauses as opposed to a ceasefire to let humanitarian aid into Gaza. It was put forward by countries such as Germany, who didn't want to be seen to interfere with Israel's right to defend itself.
I think Germany may even be more pro-Israeli in its stance and articulation of Israel's right to defend itself than the United States. And I don't think that position within Germany that commands support across the coalition is likely to change in the short to medium term, regardless of how the ground invasion progresses in Gaza and the civilian casualties and the devastation we're all now likely to see. And so that is clearly going to open up a rift within the European Council between those countries that have a slightly different position and perspective on the conflict. And that, again, I think will subtract from European legitimacy, influence.
At the UN General Assembly, 4 EU countries voted against a resolution on a ceasefire, despite the bloc having agreed a unified position a day earlier. 8 voted in favour and 15 abstained. So the question is whether this disjointed vote signals a difficulty for the EU in having any meaningful role in any future negotiations.
I think it can still have a role. It is now, it has now to deal with a kind of handicap with regard to Arab countries and more globally, more generally, with many partners in the South that have lost somewhat their confidence in the European Union diplomacy. So we have to rebuild that. We have to reach out to all of them. But never forget that it was the European Union that came up with the idea of a two-state solution, the need for self-determination for the Palestinian, the support for the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people.
The EU has committed to an international peace conference to revive talks on a two-state solution. It was a demand put forward by Spain, who wanted stronger support for Palestinians in Gaza. In the meantime, the crushing war continues. Shona Murray, Euronews, Brussels.
Repelling Ukrainian attacks across the Dnieper River and holding territory in occupied Kherson region remains a high priority objective for Russian forces in Ukraine, states the UK Defense Ministry in its daily intelligence update, adding that the Russian forces in this area are under the increased pressure to defend the occupied positions. As an indicator, the UK Defense Ministry refers to the change of command. As reported by Russian state-backed media, the deputy commander of Russian forces in Ukraine, Colonel General Mikhail Teplinsky, has likely personally taken over command of Russia's Dnipro grouping of forces. The force is responsible for the occupied areas of Kherson region, including the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. The fighting here has intensified in recent weeks as Ukrainian forces have contested Russian control of the river's eastern bank. Ukrainian forces continue to hold positions in the east bank of Kherson region. Russian sources claim that Ukrainian forces control central Krynki, which is about 30 kilometers east of Kherson city, and might have marginally expanded their zone of control west of Krynki. Geolocated footage confirms that Russian forces hold positions in forest areas east of Krynki. Multiple Russian sources, including a Wagner Group-affiliated channel, complained about Russia's forces' lack of counter-battery, electronic warfare and command and control capabilities in the Kherson direction, particularly near Krynki.
On a Balkan charm offensive, with EU expansion the ultimate goal, Ursula von der Leyen was in Belgrade to meet Alexander Vučić. The presidents of the EU Commission and Serbia both acknowledged that a major stumbling block remains tensions between Serbia and Kosovo, and ensuring both sides abide by the Ohrid Agreement that was signed in March.
It is about the implementation of the Ohrid Agreement. This Ohrid Agreement foresees various steps, which include, for example, the recognition of documents and institutions by Serbia. And this, on the other hand, goes along with the establishment of the Association of Serb-majority municipalities. This has to be delivered by Kosovo.
Serbia's president insisted that for the agreement to work, commitments were needed by both sides, commitments he said Kosovo had failed to meet.
Mi znamo što su naše obaveze iz dijaloga i te svoje obaveze smo spremni da ispunimo. Imali smo mi sve papire koje je samo trebalo poštovati, dakle i principe usvojene, 4 dokumenta koje se odnose na zajednicu srpskih opština. Nijedan nije primenjen.
The EU Commission President is keen to point out that if political divisions cannot be overcome, Serbia could pay a hefty economic price. She believes its GDP could double in 10 years if it works with the EU.
With the Christmas shopping period just weeks away, consumer prices in the Eurozone fell sharply, reaching their lowest level in more than 2 years. Inflation came in at 2.9% in October, down from 4.3% the month before, according to the EU Statistics Office, who made the announcement on Tuesday. The main cause was the double-digit drop in fuel prices, which eased by 11.1%. The better-than-expected inflation data is getting closer to the 2% target set by the European Central Bank, whose policy of higher interest rates has contributed to the calm on the price front. But at the same time, growth disappeared as output shrank after months of stagnation. Germany, the largest of the 20 countries using the euro, saw its economic output fall by 0.1%, while France, the second largest economy, recorded growth of just 0.1%.
Britain's King Charles III has expressed greatest sorrow and the deepest regret for what he called the abhorrent and unjustifiable acts of violence committed against Kenyans as they sought independence. However, he stopped short of an explicit apology for Britain's actions in its former colony, something many Kenyans have been calling for. At the start of his 4-day visit to Kenya, the king laid flowers at the tomb of the unknown soldier, the same spot where independence was declared 60 years